There was a time when American luxury didn't need to prove anything. It didn't need screens. It didn't need flashy technology. It didn't even need to be fast. Because during the 1960s, some American manufacturers discovered something different. Elegance. Not necessarily the most expensive cars, not necessarily the most powerful, but the cars that even today, more than half a century later, still look sophisticated. Some of the cars you're about to see are so elegant that they make many modern automobiles look like simple household appliances. Let's begin. 1968 Chrysler New Yorker. This car never tried to look sporty, and honestly, it didn't need to. Because while many manufacturers spent the 1960s trying to make their cars more aggressive or more attention-grabbing, the New Yorker followed a completely different philosophy: luxury on a grand scale. Imagine arriving at a luxury hotel in 1968, limousines, business executives, and then this enormous Chrysler pulls up, long, imposing, and carrying a presence that immediately communicated prestige. It wasn't a car designed to impress through speed. It was designed to impress simply by being there. Visually, the New Yorker perfectly represented late 1960s American luxury: the massive front grille, the clean lines, the enormous proportions. Everything projected a sense of importance. But here's where things become even more interesting. Under that massive hood sat the legendary 440 cubic inch V8, an engine capable of producing around 350 horsepower, a very serious number for its time. And although the New Yorker was not a sports car, it could accelerate from 0 to 60 miles per hour in roughly 8 seconds, faster than most people would expect from a machine so large and luxurious. And that contrast is part of its charm, because it looked like an office on wheels, yet it hid enough power to move its enormous dimensions with complete authority. Inside, the experience was exactly what you would expect from a luxury Chrysler: wide seats, high-quality materials, and a level of comfort designed to cover long distances effortlessly. Today, a well-preserved 1968 Chrysler New Yorker typically ranges between $20,000 and $45,000, depending on condition and originality. 1965 Lincoln Continental. This car didn't look like an automobile. It looked like a statement of power. Very few American cars of the 1960s projected as much elegance as the Continental, because while many manufacturers embraced huge tail fins, excessive chrome, and increasingly dramatic styling, Lincoln chose a completely different path: sophistication, and the result was spectacular. At first glance, the Continental looked different. The lines were clean, the proportions were nearly perfect, and the absence of excess gave it an almost timeless presence. It's no coincidence that this model became one of the defining symbols of the American elite during the 1960s. Everyone wanted to be seen in a Continental. And here's where the story becomes even more interesting, because beneath that elegant body sat a massive 430 cubic inch V8, producing around 320 horsepower. It wasn't a sports car, but it certainly wasn't slow. It could accelerate from 0 to 60 miles per hour in approximately 9 seconds. A surprisingly strong figure for a machine so large, refined, and comfort-oriented. And that contrast is exactly what makes the Continental so special. Because it looked like a luxury limousine, yet moved with far more confidence than its size would suggest. Inside, the level of refinement was extraordinary for its era. Wide seats, high-quality finishes, and an atmosphere that felt more like a private lounge than an automobile. Today, a well-preserved 1965 Lincoln Continental typically ranges between $35,000 and $80,000, depending on condition and originality. 1964 Imperial Crown Coupe. This car wasn't built to compete with Cadillac. It was built to surpass Cadillac. And honestly, you can feel that from the very first moment. Because during the 1960s, Imperial represented the highest level of luxury within Chrysler. It wasn't simply another large automobile. It was the car that demonstrated just how far American luxury could go when budget was not the priority. And visually, it was impossible to ignore. The massive front grille, the elegant lines, the majestic proportions. Everything projected exclusivity. But unlike many luxury cars of the era, The Imperial also had a personality of its own. It didn't look like a Cadillac. It didn't look like a Lincoln. It looked like an Imperial, and that gave it a very special identity. There's a particularly interesting detail. The designers intentionally sought to create a more formal and distinguished appearance than its rivals. As a result, the car projected an almost presidential presence. It looked like the kind of automobile that belonged to a CEO, a diplomat, or an important public figure. Under the massive hood sat the powerful 413 cubic inch V8, an engine capable of producing around 340 horsepower, a substantial figure for a luxury coupe in the mid-1960s. Today, a well-preserved 1964 Imperial Crown Coupe typically ranges between $30,000 and $70,000, depending on condition and originality. And now, I want to know something. Between the Chrysler New Yorker, the Lincoln Continental, and this Imperial Crown Coupe, which one do you think is the most elegant? Let me know in the comments, because what comes next takes us to one of the most refined Cadillacs of the entire decade. 1966, Cadillac Fleetwood 60 Special. This car didn't need to demand attention, because its elegance spoke for itself. While many luxury automobiles of the 1960s still relied on heavy chrome and flashy details, Cadillac decided to offer something different, a more mature form of elegance, more restrained, more sophisticated. And the result was impressive. At first glance, the Fleetwood projected authority. The body was long, the lines were clean, and the proportions felt perfectly balanced. It didn't look aggressive, it looked important. And that distinction is exactly what makes it so appealing even today. There's a very interesting detail. During the 1960s, the 60 Special was considered one of the preferred Cadillacs among business executives, politicians, and high-level professionals. It was an automobile built for people who wanted luxury without constantly advertising it. And that philosophy is clearly reflected in its design. Under the hood sat the refined 429 cubic inch V8, an engine capable of producing around 340 horsepower, a very respectable figure for a luxury sedan of the era. Thanks to that power, it could accelerate from 0 to 60 miles per hour in approximately 9 seconds. Today, a well-preserved 1966 Cadillac Fleetwood 60 Special typically ranges between $25,000 and $60,000, depending on condition and originality. And more than half a century later, it remains one of the finest examples of classic American luxury ever created. 1961 Cadillac Eldorado Biarritz. This car didn't look like a luxury automobile. It looked like a work of art on wheels. And honestly, very few American cars from any decade have managed to project as much elegance as the Eldorado Biarritz. Because if the Fleetwood represented understated luxury, the Eldorado represented luxury at its absolute peak. It was the Cadillac everyone dreamed of owning, the car that sat at the very top of the lineup, and that was immediately obvious. The body was low, long, and spectacularly elegant. The enormous tail fins were still present, but now they felt more refined than excessive. Chrome was everywhere, and yet, it never felt overdone. It simply looked expensive, very expensive, and that was exactly the message Cadillac wanted to send. The Biarritz was one of the most exclusive automobiles Cadillac offered in the early 1960s. It wasn't a car for everyone. It was a symbol of success. But here's where the story gets even better, because beneath all that elegance sat a massive 390 cubic inch V8, an engine capable of producing around 325 horsepower, an impressive figure for 1961. And once again, we find the contrast that defines this entire video. Because at first glance, it looked like a car designed solely to cruise past luxury hotels. But in reality, it hit a very respectable amount of power for its era. Today, a well-preserved 1961 Cadillac Eldorado Biarritz typically ranges between $80,000 and $180,000, depending on condition and originality. 1969 Buick Riviera. This car looked almost too elegant to be American, and that is precisely what makes it so special, because while many late 1960s American luxury cars continued to rely on enormous dimensions and heavy chrome trim, the Riviera chose a completely different path, more sophisticated, more sporting. And the result was spectacular. At first glance, the Riviera had a presence that was impossible to mistake. The incredibly long hood, the perfectly proportioned roofline, and that flowing muscular bodywork. Everything looked as though it had been shaped by a sculptor. It wasn't a car that depended on decorative details to attract attention. Its silhouette did all the work. And here's where it becomes even more interesting. Because many enthusiasts consider the late 1960s Riviera to be one of the best designed American automobiles ever created. And when you look at it today, it's easy to understand why. Every line seems to be exactly where it belongs. Nothing feels unnecessary. Nothing feels missing. But elegance was not its only strength. Under the hood sat the powerful 430 cubic inch V8, producing around 360 horsepower, a very serious figure for the time. Thanks to that, it could accelerate from 0 to 60 miles per hour in approximately 7.5 seconds. An impressive performance figure for a luxury coupe of this size. Today, a well-preserved 1969 Buick Riviera typically ranges between $30,000 and $80,000, depending on condition and originality. And now I want to know something. Between the Cadillac Eldorado Biarritz and this stunning Buick Riviera, which one do you think is more elegant? The extravagance of the Cadillac or the almost perfect proportions of the Riviera? Let me know in the comments, because the next car proves that Buick could be even more luxurious than many people realize. 1962, Buick Electra 225. This car wasn't trying to be flashy, it was trying to be perfect. And honestly, that's one of the reasons the Electra 225 has aged so gracefully. Because while other manufacturers competed to attract as much attention as possible, Buick chose a different path. Refined elegance. From every angle, the Electra projected balance. The body was enormous, but it never looked heavy. The lines were long, but never exaggerated, and the chrome details were certainly present, yet used with far more restraint than many of its rivals. Everything felt carefully calculated, and that gave the car a very distinctive sophistication. Under the massive hood sat the famous 401 cubic inch nailhead V8. An engine capable of producing around 325 horsepower, an impressive figure for an early 1960s luxury automobile. And that's exactly what makes it so interesting, because nothing about its design suggested that kind of performance. The Electra looked like a car designed solely for quiet, comfortable travel, but it hid far more power than most people imagined. Today, a well-preserved 1962 Buick Electra 225 typically ranges between $25,000 and $60,000, depending on condition and originality. 1967 Cadillac Eldorado. This car completely changed the way Cadillac understood elegance. And honestly, from the moment it appeared, it was obvious we were looking at something different. Because while most American luxury cars continued growing in size and becoming increasingly ornate, the new Eldorado chose a much more modern direction. Cleaner, more sophisticated, more daring, and the result was spectacular. At first glance, the car looked more European than American. The body was low, wide, and extraordinarily elegant. The lines were fluid and perfectly proportioned, and for the first time in the model's history, Cadillac abandoned the enormous tail fins that had defined much of the previous decade. Everything looked more refined, more contemporary, more exclusive. And here's where things become even more interesting. Because the 1967 Eldorado wasn't just one of the most elegant Cadillacs ever built. It was also one of the most innovative. It featured front-wheel drive, an extremely unusual solution for an American luxury car of that size. And that allowed the designers to create entirely new proportions. The result was a car that still looks surprisingly modern today. Under the hood sat the massive 429 cubic inch V8. An engine capable of producing around 340 horsepower, more than enough to move this luxurious coupe with absolute authority. Thanks to that, it could accelerate from 0 to 60 miles per hour in approximately 8 seconds. An impressive figure for an automobile designed primarily around comfort and prestige. And that perfectly summarizes the Eldorado, because it looked like a piece of high-end industrial design, while hiding the power necessary to back up that presence. Today, a well-preserved 1967 Cadillac Eldorado typically ranges between $35,000 and $90,000, depending on condition and originality. And when you look at all of these cars together, you begin to understand something very interesting. American elegance in the 1960s didn't have a single shape. Sometimes it was enormous and majestic. Sometimes it was refined and understated. And other times it was modern and revolutionary. But they all shared one thing: presence. And now I want to know your opinion. Out of every car we saw today, which one do you think was the most elegant? The imposing Lincoln Continental? The sophisticated Buick Riviera? Or perhaps the revolutionary Cadillac Eldorado? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this journey through the most elegant luxury cars of the 1960s, don't miss the video appearing on your screen right now, because there, we're going to explore the most beautiful American cars of the 1960s. And trust me, some of those machines were so spectacular that even today they still look like rolling works of art. I'll see you there.